Tom Horn first arrived in Wyoming in 1892. He had spent the better part of a decade chasing Apache down in Arizona before diving headfirst into a feud known as the Pleasant Valley War. Although Tom's actions during the feud remain unclear, it's believed that he fought on the side of the Tewksburys against their avowed enemies, the Grahams. And despite wearing the badge of a Gila County Sheriff's deputy, Horn would participate in the lynchings of at least 3 men. This was followed by a stint with the Pinkertons, a job that saw Tom working on the behest of the cattle barons up in Johnson County, Wyoming. Once again, Horn's involvement is somewhat shrouded in mystery, but he is suspected of assassinating 2 men on behalf of the large ranchers. Whether or not that's true is unknown, but Tom did absolutely, for sure, put an end to a bunch of bandits known as the Red Sash Gang. Horn would then head south and find employment as a range detective on John Coble's Iron Mountain Ranch, pretty much doing the same type of work he had done in Johnson County, investigating stock theft and working as an enforcer for the large spreads. The only difference was, by this point in time, Horn had lost all faith in the judicial system. Rather than waste time arresting criminals only for the courts to set them free, Tom resolved to handle business his own way. And it just so happened that his own way involved a whole hell of a lot of bloodshed. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. John C. Coble first came to Wyoming in the early 1880s. Partnered with a British aristocrat by the name of Sir Horace Plunkett up in Johnson County before starting a new spread a few years later near Iron Mountain, some 20 or so miles north of Cheyenne. In time, Coble's operation would include 4 separate ranches and thousands of head of cattle. Not quite as prolific as the nearby Swan Land and Cattle Company, but make no mistake about it, John Coble was indeed one of the big players there in Wyoming. And as such, Coble absolutely hated the smaller homesteaders encroaching on what he considered to be his own personal territory. Not only were these homesteaders filing on land in between Coble's various ranches, but they also started stringing up barbed wire and fencing off the pastures. Sure, there was a legitimate issue with stock theft, but mostly it was the small ranchers who were the bane of Coble's existence. Guys like Kells Nickel, who had the absolute gall to settle down right smack dab in the middle of that Iron Mountain range. This was done legally, mind you, but Coble was there first, and it doesn't appear that he was all that keen on sharing, especially not with the likes of Kells Nickel, a man once described as stubborn, red-headed, and quarrelsome. And I love that whoever said that threw in the fact that he was red-headed. As far as I'm concerned, that alone is enough of a crime to see him ran out of the county. I guess it could have been worse, right? I mean, Kells could have also been left-handed. Ugh, yuck. In all seriousness, though, Nickel was indeed quarrelsome, even to the point of threatening to poison his own land in order to kill any trespassing cattle. And then, in July of 1890, he damn near killed John Coble. They had got to arguing at a train depot, one thing led to another, and Kells Nickel pulled a knife and slashed open Coble's abdomen. And despite charges being filed, Nickel suffered 0 legal repercussions. Now we'll return to Kells Nickel here shortly. Turns out he would play a very pivotal role in the last days of Tom Horn. But for now, suffice it to say, there were many other small homesteaders there in southeastern Wyoming, just like Kells Nickel. More than enough business to keep a man like Tom Horn busy. And really, this was just a repeat of what had recently occurred up in Johnson County. Like I said, there were legit outlaws stealing cattle, but for the most part, the large ranchers like John Coble simply wanted the land that the homesteaders had filed on, and since the law was on the side of the homesteaders, they began to hire men like Tom Horn to handle business. Only difference between Tom's time up there in Johnson County and where he was working at now, further to the southeast, was that Horn had finally came to a point where he was willing to resort to murder in order to see to it that his will and the will of his employers was imposed. Not only did Tom have a hatred of thieves in general, or so he claimed, but he was no longer willing to rely on the justice system. If the judges and juries were unwilling to punish these alleged transgressors, then by God, he'd see what he could do about it personally. For a price, of course. A price that John Coble was more than willing to pay. Tom's first victim was a guy by the name of William Lewis, a British immigrant with a tiny spread just due south of Iron Mountain. At least 2 previous attempts had been made on Lewis's life, and even though his home was torched by arsonists, Lewis refused to tuck tail and run. Instead, he rented a building from a neighbor and kept right on working his small spread. Or at least he did until his bullet-ridden and decomposing body was discovered on the 3rd of August, 1895. A little over a month later, the same thing happened to one of Lewis's neighbors, Frederick Powell. Once again, a small-time rancher and suspected thief. Powell, like Lewis, was warned, even received an ominous letter stating, quote, "Mr. Powell, this is your third and last warning. There are 3 things for you to do. Quit killing other people's cattle, or be killed yourself, or leave the country yourself at once." End quote. I reckon Powell was a little too slow in leaving, and on the 10th of September, 1895, he too was gunned down. Skip ahead a few days later, and yet another homesteader, Willie Green, met with the same fate. Now, Green's death would be ruled a suicide, but you know how that goes. As for Tom's involvement, it was pretty much an open secret that he was the one doing all this killing, at least as far as Powell and Lewis were concerned. Hell, the man wasn't even being discreet. Powell's widow, Mary, claimed that she and her husband had noticed Tom lurking in the distance. He tried intimidating them during a roundup and was even seen trailing Powell, both by them and their 9-year-old son, in the days leading up to the murder. Historian Larry Ball posits, quote, "Perhaps his purpose in moving about so openly was to terrorize people whom his employers wanted to leave the region. When Fred Powell did not scare, Horn may have felt compelled to kill him." End quote. And yeah, that was part of Tom's MO. Can't say he didn't warn anybody, right? He was known to boldly ride through a section of the range, and then within just a few days, people would begin packing up and hauling ass. When that failed, Tom would then send an anonymous letter. And after that, well, that's when he started sending bullets. In October of 95, a special grand jury was convened in Cheyenne to investigate the murders of Powell and Lewis, but nothing ever came of it. Most of the witnesses were too scared to testify, and despite the jury coming to within 2 votes of bringing an indictment against Tom Horn, his wealthy friends soon came to his rescue and began greasing the right palms. Tom, I guess feeling cocky and living up to his Apache nickname, the boy who talks about himself, then took to boasting of the murders in local saloons. He even joked about the terrible scream that Lewis let out when he realized he was about to die, saying that he was, quote, "the scaredest son of a bitch you ever saw," end quote. As you can imagine, it wasn't long before everybody within 100 miles knew that Tom Horn was guilty as hell. Even the newspapers were reporting on it. So much so that Tom, either on his own volition or that of his employers, soon decided that it might just be a good idea to shut the hell up for a little while and make himself scarce. Ended up heading back south to Arizona, where he found work as a ranch foreman for his old pal, Burt Dunlap. Keep in mind that Tom, despite his murderous proclivities, was a pretty solid hand when it came to ranch work. He would, however, still find time to go on the occasional adventure. In March 1896, he helped Arizona authorities arrest 2 men wanted for burglary. And then, later on that summer, Tom joined the military in their efforts at hunting down the infamous Apache Kid. Roughly around the same age as Tom Horn, the Apache Kid was, as his nickname suggests, Apache by birth. Got captured by the Yuma as a child before being freed by the U.S. Army. In time, the kid would grow close to Tom's old mentor, Al Sieber, and become a scout, working his way up to the rank of sergeant and playing a very active role in the various campaigns against Geronimo. That said, things would take a drastic turn in May of 1887. Sieber, along with a few other officials, had left San Carlos on business, and in their absence, the Apache Kid was placed in charge of the scouts. Unfortunately, somebody decided to throw a party, and that's when things went off the rails. A drunken scout known as Gonzizi gunned down the kid's father, and in turn, the kid and his buddies murdered Gonzizi along with Gonzizi's brother. As you can imagine, when Sieber returned, he wasted no time in confronting the Apache Kid. Said that he and his accomplices needed to hand over their weapons and comply with the investigation, which they did. Everything was going smooth until a commotion broke out in the crowd. It's theorized that some of the assembled Apache were thinking that the kid and his buddies would be sent to exile in Florida, just like Geronimo. Things got tense, and then all of a sudden, several of the Apache went lunging for their weapons. In the melee that ensued, Al Sieber took a bullet to the leg, and the Apache Kid was able to escape. He did surrender a month later, though, and despite he and 4 other scouts being sentenced to jail, the kid's conviction ended up getting overturned the following year. Apparently, this caused quite a bit of outrage there in Arizona, so there was a new trial, this time in a civilian court, and the kid was once again sentenced to hard time at the Yuma State Prison. On the way there, in November of 1889, is when the kid and his buddies rose up and killed Tom Horn's former boss, Sheriff Glenn Reynolds. And after that, he pretty much just vanished. In the years that followed, the kid would become a legend there in the Southwest, with damn near every unsolved murder and rape being laid at his feet. and by the time that Horn made his grand return to Arizona, the bounty on the kid's head had reached a whopping $6,000. There was a large campaign held during the summer of '96, led by Colonel Edwin and the 7th Cav, and Tom did join them in the field as a scout and guide. Didn't amount to much, though. The Apache Kid remained free, and Horn ended up mustering out towards the end of September. Believe it or not, to this day, the fate of the Apache Kid remains a mystery. I hope to dive into the research more in the future, but there were ranchers blaming the kid for stealing their livestock even as late as the 1920s. Sounds hard to believe, but if you're a new listener, you may be surprised to learn that a small band of Apache did indeed remain hidden and active down in Mexico for decades after the surrender of Geronimo. Matter of fact, these Bronco Apaches raided New Mexico in 1926 and killed a cowboy before making off with a small herd of horses. 1926. That's the same year Mel Brooks was born, and the last time I checked, old Mel is still alive. How crazy is that there is someone alive right now who was also alive at the same time when wild-ass Apaches were making raids? If you're looking to learn more about that, you might want to check out the episode I did on the Bronco Apache, linked down below. Anyway, my entire point in bringing them up is that there are some who think that the Apache Kid ended up joining with these Broncos, but really nobody can say for certain. Fun fact, one of the young soldiers who joined Tom in his quest to locate the Apache Kid was none other than Edgar Rice Burroughs, future creator of Tarzan. Now, it wasn't long after the hunt for the kid that Tom was contacted by U.S. Marshal William Meade to help track down a group of outlaws known as the High Fives. The only thing was, Marshal Meade evidently didn't know who he was dealing with. In November of 1896, Tom wrote the following letter in response to the Marshal's request. Quote, "If the business is not too pressing, and you write and explain to me, I will give you my assistance if I can. If it concerns the outlaws on the border, the High Five Gang, and you were going out with a posse, I could not go, as I know that with any posse you could get, you could not accomplish anything, as no one knows as well as myself the way in which the posse would be handicapped. I can stand a better show to get them by going alone, and will go and get some of them at least and drive the rest out of the country if there's anything in it for me." End quote. In other words, Tom was saying that he would drive them out by any means necessary, wink wink, if the marshal was willing to pony up a little bit of money. No word on whether or not Marshal Meade ever got back to Tom, but it appears he did not. The High Fives, headed by outlaw Black Jack Christian, not Ketchum, Christian, would soon come to an abrupt end, but it weren't at the hands of Tom Horn. Here's another fun fact for you. The noted desperado that I mentioned a moment ago, Jack Ketchum, was once mistaken for the leader of the High Fives, Black Jack Christian, which is ultimately how Ketchum ended up also being called Black Jack. The more you know. As for Tom Horn, he would continue to do a little ranching and mining there in Arizona, but by early 1898, he was already back in Wyoming. I guess he figured that the dust had settled and that he was no longer in danger of being arrested over the Powell and Lewis murders. Also, this is right around the same time that yet another adventure beckoned. Just so happened that the United States was gearing up to go to war with Spain, and Tom, being the patriot that he was, volunteered his expertise as a civilian packer, the chief packer to be exact, with several pack masters under his direct command. They arrived off the coast of Cuba with the Army's 5th Corps in June of 1898, and Tom and his men had to physically offload the mules into the surf by throwing them overboard and swimming them to shore. Luckily, they were not under fire while doing so. Now, just in case you aren't aware, the Spanish-American War lasted all of 5 minutes. I'm exaggerating, of course, but by July 14th, the Spanish forces there in Santiago had surrendered. Tom remained, however, working for the quartermaster until September 6th when he was released from duty and boarded a ship bound for the Big Apple, New York, New York, a city so nice they named it twice. Now, I know it doesn't sound like much, but Tom and his packers were an integral part of the military's victory there in Cuba. These mule trains were the only means of providing troops with much-needed supplies and ammunition. And, as was the case with the Apache down in Arizona, Horn would often find himself dodging bullets. Fact of the matter is that Horn's service in Cuba was beyond honorable. Tom had a tough job to do, and he did it well. I have no doubt that he and his packers risked life and limb on several occasions in support of the troops, not to mention enduring many a privation and hardship as they hauled supplies to the front. Not only would other veterans sing their praises, but Major General Shafter himself would state, quote, "The pack train saved us. They were invaluable." End quote. Far as I'm concerned, that's something to be proud of. Still, though, for whatever reason, Horn felt the need to exaggerate his actions, even going so far as to say that only 9 of the men serving with him made it back home alive. I guess the insinuation is that they saw so much combat that nearly all of the Packers were killed in the line of duty. Well, as it turns out, Tom only lost 1 Packer, and it was on account of a sickness rather than combat. Indeed, the yellow fever proved to be far more deadly than Spanish bullets there in Cuba. Even Tom Horn caught him a case. Truth be told, a pretty serious case. Lost around 40 pounds, and things would get even worse by the time he arrived back stateside. By the way, did you know that the U.S. Marines still to this day run a course on mule packing? Not to be confused with the fudge packing that most of my devil dog buddies usually find themselves partaking in. Apparently, the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California, still includes instructions on how to properly care for and pack a mule train. Per an article I found on Marines.mil, quote, during the month-long exercise, Marines from motor transportation trained in animal packing and small unit mobility geared toward mountaineering skills and high-altitude warfare. Marines learned to tie harnesses, rig saddles, load equipment, and navigate with their individual animals through mountainous terrain, end quote. I don't know, I thought that was pretty cool. Just goes to show you how valuable of a skill that Tom Horn was putting to use there in Cuba. And I guess when it comes to very rugged and mountainous terrain like in Afghanistan, especially at very high altitudes, these old school methods of moving supplies can prove very effective. Any veterans out there that know more about these Marine Corps Packers, please feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear more about it. Josh@wildwestextra.com. Anyway, let's get back to Tom Horn. Remember, he was sick as a dog by the time he arrived in New York and didn't waste no time in getting back to Wyoming. His old boss, John Coble, thought that Horn looked like a damn walking skeleton, so he arranged for the former scout to convalesce in a Cheyenne boarding house. Guess they figured that the lady who ran the boarding house would be able to give Tom a little more TLC than he would receive in a ranch bunkhouse. And they were correct. Tom quickly began to recuperate, and by February of 1899, he was finally able to make his way around town on his own 2 feet. A resident of Cheyenne would later claim that Tom celebrated his newfound health by going on a quote-unquote big drunk. And as soon as he was able to sit a saddle, he lit out on yet another adventure, this time in pursuit of Butch Cassidy and the Hole-in-the-Wall gang. Now, I'm pretty sure that Cassidy doesn't need no introduction, but just in case, I'll give it a go. Butch's criminal career began at the age of 14 when he stole a pair of jeans and a slice of pie. He took the cowboy in for a while, and by 1899, graduated from stealing pants to robbing banks. His gang, often referred to as the Wild Bunch or the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, included such notorious members as Flat-Nosed George Curry, Robert Lee, Harvey Logan, and his brother Lonnie, Bob Curry, and of course Harry Longabaugh, aka the Sundance Kid. Now, these weren't exactly choir boys prior to the summer of 1899, but they really made a name for themselves that June when they took down the Union Pacific's Overland Flyer just north of Laramie. The robbery, which occurred at the Wilco train station, netted the desperados a cool $50,000, or close to $2 million in today's money. It also kicked off one hell of a manhunt. Posses were formed, rewards were offered, and even Tom's old employer, the Pinkertons, got into the action. Only problem was Butch and his gang had seemingly scattered with the wind. The outlaws split up into several small groups and went to ground. Some of them hiding out as far south as New Mexico, some in Colorado, and even some up in Montana. Needless to say, the law was going to have to swing a pretty wide net if they wanted to catch these bandits. That's when someone came up with the pretty ingenious idea of a still hunt. Rather than have hundreds of detectives and lawmen just riding aimlessly throughout the countryside, all willy-nilly like, they instead dispersed across the west and just sort of stayed put. Kind of like a deer hunter in a blind, patiently waiting for the Wild Bunch to pop their heads up. Tom's former colleague from the Pinkertons, Charlie Siringo, was heading up the hunt in the southern Rockies as Horn focused his search further to the north. And joining him in the field was his feuding buddy from Arizona, Edwin Tewksbury. If you'll recall, Ed was the last man standing during the Pleasant Valley War. Worth pointing out, though, that Tom wasn't much for sitting still. So while everybody else was remaining put and patiently waiting, he and Ed were constantly on the move. As to who was funding Horn in his search for the Wild Bunch, that's not really clear. Siringo was still on the Pinkerton payroll, but Tom was not. Author Larry Ball theorizes that Tom could have been working for the Union Pacific or possibly even Frank Hatzel, the U.S. Marshal out of Wyoming, or maybe even both. Whatever the case, I can assure you that Tom was most definitely getting paid. This man did not work for free. He and Tewksbury began their chase in Johnson County, soon made their way through southeastern Montana, South Dakota, and finally Nebraska. And despite their lack of success, these were pretty credible leads, as flat-nosed George Curry had indeed traveled all the way to Nebraska to meet up with his girlfriend. He was just a tad too slippery of an eel for old Tom Horn, though. Curry got away, and Tom and Ed continued their hunt in Wyoming, focusing on a remote area known as Jackson Hole. And as fate would have it, it was there in early September 1899 where Tom and Ed gunned down a pair of suspected outlaws. Per the Rocky Mountain News, quote, "After following the trail of the two men for nearly a month, they came upon them in a camp just as they were getting supper. One was engaged in frying bacon, and the other was at some distance from the fire, getting their traps together. Horn and his companion at once opened fire on them, the man who was cooking being hit first. The other man sprang behind a tree and began shooting rapidly, one of his shots hitting Tewksbury in the leg. Horn advanced and finally got the other man as he was endeavoring to escape." End quote. As far as Tom was concerned, there was no question as to whether or not these two men were members of the gang that helped to rob the Union Pacific over at Wilcox. He stated as much to the papers, saying that he had struck their trail shortly after the holdup and had been following them the entire time. Be that as it may, his partner, Ed Tewksbury, was finished, and apparently it was not just on account of taking that bullet to the leg. Story goes that Ed and Tom had been quarreling, about what exactly I'm not sure, but there is some evidence to suggest that Tewksbury wasn't all that keen on Tom's preferred method of dispatching suspected criminals. Whether that's true or not, like I said, I don't know, but one thing's for certain. By the fall of 1899, Ed Tewksbury was about all Tom horned out and returned to Arizona. As far as I know, the two would never again cross paths. Now here's where things get interesting, and to be honest, a little confusing. Turns out the two victims killed near Jackson Hole may not have been as guilty as Tom Horn had initially claimed. And to make matters worse, he didn't even report the shootout to authorities, much less the Pinkertons or the Union Pacific. At least not at first. It wasn't until late January of 1900, a few months after the killings in question, that Horn traveled to Denver and tried to collect a bounty. That's where that little excerpt I just read from the Rocky Mountain News originated from. I guess that was Tom's first step, talking to the press just to get the ball rolling. And unfortunately for him, it was the press that would soon shine a very unflattering light on his most recent escapades. Of course, it didn't help matters none that Tom kept changing the story. As soon as the various papers began questioning his version of events, Horn began to backpedal. First, he said that the shootout had occurred just 3 weeks prior. This is not true, it had actually occurred months prior. And then, under even more scrutiny, he changed the location of the shootout and admitted that the dead men were not members of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, but instead they were just cattle thieves. He changed this again the next day, stating that no, they absolutely were part of that same bunch who held up the train at Wilcox. See what I mean about confusing? Suffice it to say, rather than collecting a reward, Tom Horn soon found himself on the brink of being arrested for murder. By the time it was all said and done, the Union Pacific had to come to Tom's aid and run a little damage control. According to them, Tom and Ed had acted in self-defense and followed proper protocol by then bringing the bodies to a nearby town, reporting the incident to the authorities, and taking responsibility for the burial. Once again, this is not true. Like I said earlier, Tom didn't report a damn thing, at least not until he was ready to collect that reward, and he did admit to leaving the bodies where they lay for the buzzards. Without any evidence that the victims were outlaws, Tom had effectively just confessed to murdering two innocent men. And believe it or not, the same exact scenario may have possibly played out again shortly thereafter. The Carbon County Sheriff's deputy named Bob Meldrum started bragging about how he and Tom had killed two additional men in a separate shootout down in Wyoming's Red Desert, just north of the border with Colorado. Supposedly, Bob and Tom had gotten on the trail of another pair of outlaws, whom they suspected as being members of Butch Cassidy's gang. And when they caught up with them, they just simply gunned them down. Tom, who evidently had not learned his lesson, once again tried to collect a bounty, but this time, the Union Pacific wanted proof. Okay, fine. Tom led detectives to the scene of the shooting, dug up the bodies, and surprise, surprise, neither one of the dead men were known criminals, much less affiliated with Butch Cassidy. Hell, truth be told, they weren't even armed. In all reality, there's a very good chance that the victims were prospectors Thomas Payne and George Woodruff, who had recently, and very conveniently, gone missing. And once again, the press had an absolute field day. The Carbon County Journal, in particular, reported that Tom had shown a reckless disregard for human life and that he should be rigidly investigated. Remember, Horn was still a person of interest when it came to the killings of Lewis and Powell way back in 1895, and this wasn't the type of attention that he or his employers were looking for. Luckily for Tom, his rich cattle-bearing buddies soon came to his rescue again and saw to it that no legal action would be taken. Kinda makes you wonder, though, how long they'd be willing to continue doing this. As for whether or not Tom expressed any remorse, he'd later refer to this most recent shooting as simply a quote-unquote funny mistake. Ultimately, Tom would fail to arrest any of the outlaws who took part in the Wilcox train robbery. Of course, that didn't stop him from lying about it. This dude just loved telling stories. In February of 1900, Horn told the Kansas City Star that he was responsible for gunning down noted hole-in-the-wall gang members Kid Curry and Bob Lee, both of whom were still very much alive when the article was printed. In fact, Kid Curry responded by stating, quote, "We know they have Tom Horn out there shooting people from ambush, but he ain't come within 100 miles of catching me. I'd like to get my hands on one of these Pinkerton bastards." End quote. While the search of these train robbers would continue, Tom Horn was no longer on the case. But he weren't exactly unemployed either. By April of 1900, he was hired by some large ranchers down in Routt County, Colorado, to help tackle a little problem they were having with cattle thieves. Or I guess I should add an asterisk to that, suspected cattle thieves. As I'm sure you're starting to notice, actual guilt didn't matter much to men like Tom Horn, or those who were paying him. Now back in those days, present-day Moffat County, Colorado did not exist. Routt County extended all the way west to the border with Utah and included part of an area known as Browns Park. I first spoke about Browns Park, aka Brown's Hole, on the series I did on Harry Tracy, but simply put, it was located in the extreme northeast corner of Utah and northwestern Colorado, an area sometimes referred to as the Three Corners. It was there where Tom would go undercover as Tom Hicks and begin working for the suspected local outlaw boss, Matt Rash, who, as it just so happened, was engaged to the famous historical hottie herself, Ann Bassett. And well, let's just say that Queen Anne didn't care much for this new arrival. According to her, Tom spoke too much and, quote, his bragging that he had been a great Indian fighter, his boastful, descriptive accounts of human slaughter he had accomplished single-handedly were exceedingly obnoxious, end quote. Story goes that Tom and Bassett had several heated arguments, and his employment there at the Rash Ranch was short-lived. Didn't really matter none, though, as within just a couple of months, Horn had collected all the evidence that he felt he needed and began posting anonymous letters on the doors of suspected outlaws, just like he had done up in Wyoming, ordering them to leave the park within 30 days or to suffer the consequences. Finally, on July 10th, 1900, Tom made good on these threats, forced his way into Matt Rash's cabin, and shot him deader in hell. Less than a month later, Tom struck again, this time killing alleged rustler Isom Dart, whose real name, by the way, was Ned Huddleston. And with a name like that, you can't blame him for changing it. Now, Dart was a black man, born into slavery, and as he grew older, he garnered one hell of a reputation as a first-rate cowboy. He was well respected by the outlaws there in Browns Park, was good friends with the recently deceased Matt Rash, and he had, most likely, participated in a little stock theft. Indeed, Dart was one of the men whom Tom had ordered to leave the area or else. And on the morning of October 3rd, that or else was delivered in the form of two .30-30 rounds fired from a Winchester rifle. Isom Dart was dead before he even hit the ground, and his buddies never even got a good look at the shooter. Now, Tom's actions, aside from being morally and legally questionable, were somewhat successful in causing the remaining outlaws to leave Browns Park, or at least quite a few of them. One, a guy by the name of Joe Davenport, would later state that every resident of the park was scared that Horn was going to kill them next. Hell, even Ann Bassett would claim that Tom had fired a few rounds through her window following the assassination of Isom Dart. And just like before, Tom would suffer no legal repercussions. Remember, this dude is not wearing a badge. Tom was a private citizen working for the wealthy ranchers and just taking the law into his own hands, acting as judge, jury, and sometimes even the executioner. The newspapers did report on these killings, even going so far as to refer to Tom as a fiend in human form, but his powerful friends once again saw to it that he got off scot-free. Little did Tom know it, but these protections would not last forever, and it wasn't long before he got himself into a pickle that even the cattle barons weren't able to get him out of. More on that soon enough, but something interesting happened between the killings of Matt Rash and Isom Dart that I think is worth mentioning. On July 15th, in the year of our Lord 1900, Tom Horn damn near lost his life. He had stopped at a saloon in Baggs, Wyoming at around 3 o'clock in the morning when he got into it with the Kelly brothers along with several of their friends. I guess Tom said the wrong thing at the wrong time and they pounced. According to an eyewitness, Ed Kelly hit Tom so hard that he went flying several feet across the room, after which the others pinned him to the ground as Ed's brother Newton pulled out a blade and ran it across Horn's throat. Had this knife penetrated just a fraction of an inch deeper, Tom would have been a dead man for sure. As it were, he just collapsed to the floor in a puddle of blood as saloon patrons rushed to find a doctor. And this was not the only time that Horn came out on the losing end of a pretty serious barroom brawl. Matter of fact, for being as deadly as a killer as Tom Horn was, he apparently wasn't worth a damn when it came to the fisticuffs. If you've ever seen the movie Tom Horn, starring Steve McQueen, there's a scene at the very beginning where Tom gets into a fight with a professional boxer, and that was based on an actual event that occurred in September of 1901. Tom was down in Denver making the rounds to various saloons, flashing a big wad of cash and bragging to all who would listen about how great he was, which is how he found himself in the Pinkertons saloon later that night, mixing it up with a boxing manager by the name of Jack McKenna. Horn threw the first punch, which by the way did not land, and this was followed by Jack McKenna beating Tom to within an inch of his life. And that's no exaggeration. Not only would Tom spend the next 2 weeks in bed, but his jaw was broke in more than one place, and he ended up needing a full facial cast. So yeah, Tom Horn wasn't exactly his generation's Muhammad Ali, to say the least. And full disclosure, neither am I. I'm not trying to make light of the fact that Tom couldn't cut much of a figure in a fist fight. I just thought it added more of an insight to his story. You know, sometimes it is easy to forget that these historical figures we discuss here on the Wild West Extravaganza were real-life people with very real complexities. As far as Horn goes, he was a bit of a walking contradiction. According to some, Tom was prone to getting drunk and picking fights whenever he was in town. Hell, he even possibly lost his job with the Pinkertons on account of drinking, and this drinking would only increase in time. That said, there are others who paint a very different picture. One saloon owner in particular, there in Cheyenne, would recall that he had never known a kinder-hearted man than Tom Horn, and that he was the most likable drunk that he had ever had the pleasure of serving a pint to. As far as the other aspects of Horn's personality, there are stories aplenty of him being distant and standoffish. Then again, many of his friends spoke of Tom as being quiet, inoffensive, and mild-mannered, in addition to being loyal to a fault. Throughout the course of his life, Horn would take part in many storied events of the Old West, from being a participant in the Apache Wars to fighting in not one but at least 2 deadly feuds, working as a Pinkerton, a cowboy, serving in Cuba during the Spanish War, and on and on. Tom chased bandits like Butch Cassidy all over the northern plains and Rockies, and had helped to apprehend desperados in the Southwest. By Wild West history standards, Tom Horn led an epic life. He also, strangely, felt the need to exaggerate or flat out lie about his actions every step along the way. Truth is, we'll likely never know who the real Tom Horn was, his true personality. 2 things are certain though. Tom was an extremely complex individual. He also, despite his lack of skills when it came to being a pugilist, remained deadly as hell with firearms. A fact that would soon become abundantly clear to an Iron Mountain homesteader we mentioned earlier named Kells Nickel. If you'll recall, it was Nickel who sliced open the belly of Tom's boss, John Coble. And if that weren't bad enough, a few years later, Kells then had the nerve to start running several thousand head of sheep right there on his ranch. According to a resident of Cheyenne, quote, Coble hates Nickel like the devil hates holy water, and because of that, he wants his land. But he never had an excuse to go after him until Nickel brought in all those sheep. You see, they had a good row a while ago, and Nickel gave him a slash that was a long time healing, and Coble isn't a man to forget. He's vindictive to the last degree, and never forgets when he has a score to settle. He drinks a dill and is ugly, overbearing, and dangerous when in his cups. He'll stick by his friends, but his friends must stick by him in everything, and he always carries a whip in hand. End quote. While I'm sure Coble did keep a literal whip close to hand, he also had a metaphorical one in the form of Thomas H. Horn Jr. The only problem was, rather than eliminating Kells Nickel, Tom instead took out the homesteader's 14-year-old son. Maybe. Turns out things might not be all they seem when it comes to Tom Horn's final days. And many historians are still in disagreement as to whether or not Tom was guilty for the crime that he'd ultimately be charged with. Now, we will be discussing this in full, so please join me here next Wednesday. I think you'll find my conclusion a little surprising. Till then, head on over to wildwestextra.com, hit that contact button. Let me know what's on your mind. Also, if you're looking for ad-free content, or you just want early access to new episodes, you can find all that and more at patreon.com/wildwestextra. Link down below. And if Patreon ain't your thing, you can get the same perks and more at intohistory.com/wildwestextra. Like I said, both options will give you completely ad-free content as well as early access. All right, till next time, try not to go picking any fights with boxing managers, okay? Or anybody for that matter. Look, man, it's 2024. Everybody knows jiu-jitsu. And everybody's got a smartphone with a camera. So you might not only find yourself getting a good old-fashioned ass whooping, but somebody might film it and put it online for the rest of us to laugh at. All right, till next week, adios.